So I've spoken at a few different conferences, but this has got to be the most challenging one for me, fitting to the theme. I like to speak to strangers, and you guys are not strangers, at least most of you. So it's really intimidating to speak in front of people that I've followed and looked up to for decades. And so it was already daunting, and then I saw Catherine Dixon's keynote, incredible keynote on Wednesday, and I thought, well, crap. But then I thought, well, at least I'm not going to be able to live up to that, and then I started to feel a lot better after that. So thanks, Catherine, for setting the bar so high. And I can't imagine a better place to do something where you feel uncomfortable than in Brazil, not only because we should be having this conference here. There's a growth of type here in this part of the world, but also because this is perhaps the most welcoming place on Earth. It's a place where I have a lot of friends, even though I've only been here once before, and I think that's pretty amazing. So thank you for your welcome. Before I get started, though, it's going to be helpful for me to know who we have in the audience, and so I want you to raise your hands if you have designed fonts that you have for sale or you plan to very soon. All right, and now I want you to keep them up. How many of you who have fonts for sale or plan to sell them have your own website where you sell those fonts? All right, so about half went down or a little more went down. Okay, thanks. So I feel a little bit unqualified, as I mentioned. I don't make fonts. I'm in awe of those people who do. And I'm also not much of a graphic designer. I don't get to use fonts as much as I'd like to, even though I buy them and use them as much as I can. And occasionally I teach at Type Camp and do a guest lecture in San Francisco once in a while, but I'm not a teacher. And I actually really stand in awe of teachers, of people like Catherine and Indra Kupferschmidt and people who are much better at that kind of thing than I. I'm almost a journalist. I write about typography and I try to report on the news in the industry, and sometimes I have an opinion and I try to articulate it. But I can't really qualify myself as a journalist because I have a lot of respect for that trade, and it requires specific training and a full-time commitment. So what's left if you don't really do all of these things? Well, there's this lowly title. And what is a consultant anyway? It's hard to imagine a more generic term. The only image that people usually have in mind when they hear the word consultant is something like this. And it's kind of boring and yucky. And so that's not really me either. Perhaps it might be better to call myself a font broker, much like stockbrokers help buyers find and buy stocks. I try to help font users choose and use fonts. But maybe anything related to Wall Street isn't such a positive term these days, given what people think of Wall Street. So maybe you can help me come up with a better term. But a lot of what I do is connecting designers with fonts, and essentially that means connecting font buyers with font users, or font sellers. And so this really is me, type designers in one ear and type users in the other ear. And part of that happens through a couple of websites. One is Typographica, where we review typefaces and books and publish short essays on the current scene. And one of these essays was something I wrote way back in 2008 about type designers' options for selling their work. And it's certainly out of date now, but there are a lot of new options. There are subscription models, and there are web font services. But the principles there, I think, can still be applied today in many ways. And so some of what I'll talk about tonight is an extension or update of that piece, but I'm not going to cover all of it. So I encourage you to go and find it in the footer at Typographica and check it out. The other site where I'm involved in connecting makers and users is Fonts in Use. This is an archive of real-world typography indexed by format, industry, and of course typeface. This is a collaborative project with major contributions by people like Florian Hardwig, Nick Sherman, Indra, who I mentioned before, and generous support of sponsors like Font Bureau and Mark Simonson. And also the contributions of people who submit their own work or work that they admire to the site. I've learned a lot about how graphic designers choose and use fonts from fonts in use. And in the last year or so, another site that informs how I experience the industry is Type Drawers. It's a typography forum with an emphasis on type design. And this is where font makers and some users gather to chat about technical issues or politics or marketing strategies or get help with new designs in progress. It took over the forum from its founder, James Puckett, in 2014, and it's now moderated by a team of 7, including Jackson Kavanaugh, Marina, Ramiro Espinoza, Nina Stossinger, James Todd, and Diana Wiseman. So this, along with a few years on the creative team at Font Shop from 2004 to 11, give you a sense of what colors my view of the industry. It's not as a creator or a user, but someone who frequently interacts with these people. And it's important that I clarify here that what I'm going to talk about concerns the Western world and Latin-specific world. Other regions and scripts certainly need study, and we should all understand more about them, but that's not my expertise. Fortunately, Toshi, where is he? He's promised me that he's going to do a talk on the Asian font market next year, so. He did, don't believe him.
I remember you asked me.
I guess you weren't listening to yourself. Your response was yes. And also what I'm focusing on is the part of the industry that I think has seen the most creative growth in the digital era, and that's the independent foundry. There are a lot of important developments that have come from larger companies, Monotype, Adobe, Google, and these contributions do benefit type designers in some way, including sponsoring ATypI and making this conference possible. But theirs is not the perspective from which I'm going to talk about today. And what do I mean by independence? This can be a fuzzy term, and I don't claim to have the only definition. In fact, there are other definitions to come. But here are two things that could represent independence in some way. One is a type foundry that's owned and run primarily by type designers. And the other is a company that's not dependent on another company, such as a single external sales platform for their livelihood. An independent foundry is dependent only on themselves for reaching the market. So now that I've got these disclaimers out of the way, let's get going. These are the 3 sections that I have in the talk. How fonts are made and sold now, and how that affects the makers and the users. And then a bit of forecasting, including some warnings and advice and cautionary tales, and maybe some hopeful developments. So first, some definitions. I'm very sorry to the type design veterans in the room. You're going to have to bear with me, but I do happen to know there are a lot of people at this conference in particular who can benefit from some of these definitions. And I think it benefits us all if we're speaking from the same common language. So when I speak of buying and selling fonts, I mean, of course, selling licenses to use those fonts and offering those on the retail market, as opposed to custom work, for example. By the way, this is not what fonts look like, of course, and this is not how fonts are made. I asked Laura Serra to draw some pictures because I think it gets a little boring looking at the same font icons and diagrams, and we might as well enjoy some lighthearted imagery while we talk about this serious crap. Otherwise, things get too dry. And this is not how people shop for fonts. A shopper pushing a shopping cart. Although, I once saw this very thing. This was on the street in East Berlin. So maybe it's not so crazy. But yes, we know that the font market has expanded way beyond the professional design agencies and designers. Font buyers now include those consumers who are, what's that? Oh, I thought, there's consumers, there's amateur designers, there's hobbyists, there are people who have no connection with professional design who are buying fonts now. And they often have no experience in licensing them or picking type. So the font buyer is much more than they used to be, and that continues to change. Here's a foundry. We know where the term foundry comes from. And some people think that maybe it's an antiquated term because we don't deal with metal anymore. But I think it's kind of nice to have something for our industry that is specific to us. And for our purposes, that's a company that manufactures fonts. And they can be a small studio with 2 or 3 people, or even, as is very often the case, just a single person at home working on fonts in their spare time. Or it could be a medium-sized foundry, a full-time operation with several employees. Or in a few cases, it's a larger company, relative to most foundries, with dozens of employees. Foundries can sell fonts from one designer or hundreds of designers, whether or not they are people who regularly contribute to running the company. But to the customer, a foundry is often merely seen as a marketing label, or a mark or a brand, not necessarily a company. And the person and the people behind this company are sometimes forgotten or invisible. To me, the best foundries do a good job of showcasing the designers behind their brand. One more definition, retailer. This is known by different terms. There's reseller, there's distributor, they're used just as often. But for our purposes, this is a store where someone can buy fonts from a variety of foundries. And I like the word retailer over the other terms here because that describes their primary role in this particular chain, to offer fonts on the retail market. There are large and small retailers. Most of us know about MyFonts or FontShop or Fonts.com. FontSpring has had quite a run in recent years. But there are also retailers that are limited to a few hand-picked foundries. You could think of these like a boutique shop, Village, Type Trust, and Font Stand, which you'll hear about a little later. And then there are specialty retailers that just offer a specific offering, like web fonts or desktop syncing or a library subscription. So let's get to the current state of the market, at least the way it's looked over the last couple of years, and how fonts get from a type designer's head to public release. The core of font production is the foundry, as we mentioned, and we've always had an idea of what foundries are like and how they've changed, but that hasn't really been quantified in any studious way until recently when this report was produced. Ruxandra Duru is a graphic designer in Barcelona. She's currently designing book covers at Penguin Random House. And in 2011, she was attending the EINA Center of Art and Design in Barcelona and getting her master's in advanced typography. Her thesis project was Type Foundries Today, a self-described study of independent type foundries. She researched the history of digital type, examined most of the current players in the Western world, and interviewed a group of them to get a sense of what it's like to make and sell fonts in 2011. This resulted in some revealing data about what occupies their time as a business and how often they collaborate with other type designers and where they choose to distribute their fonts. This report was distributed as a PDF, and it got a little bit of attention, but not as much as I thought it deserved. And so when I discovered it, I asked her if she'd like to distribute it to a larger audience via the web. And so we made plans to publish it on Typographica. And then after a lot of hard work from her and our web designer, Chris Hamamoto, and co-editor, Karen Litherland, we finally published the report a few weeks ago. So the first version of Type Foundries Today on the web is a 2013 update. It's a census and analysis of the independent font industry in the Western world. But before I dig into it, I need to acknowledge that Ruxandra should be here. We tried very hard to bring her, but her work wouldn't allow it. But I wish I could share the stage with her. The best that I can do is play a little video that she sent to you all.
Hola, Sao Paulo. I'm Ruxandra Duru. I hope you've all had a great time in Brazil. I wish I could have been there to talk about the project Type Foundries Today in person, but I know it's in very good hands with Stephen. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who's been involved in the publication process and all those who generously share their time and information. I guess some of you are there, without whom this would have not been possible. And I'd also like to add that as of today, this project is just a start and that it will hopefully evolve into a more complete representation of the type Foundries scene. I wish you a very pleasant stay in Brazil, and I'll leave you with Stephen. Bye!
I don't know what to do after a video like that plays. Are we supposed to talk to her, applaud? I don't. But I wish she was here. I totally do. I'm glad that she could send that at least so you could get a sense of what she's like. She's been great to work with on this. So we're going to take, if I can, a quick look at the site. Not spend too much time on it because you can all visit it yourself. Thinks that we're on a mobile. Here's one of the things we'd like to improve. It doesn't work on your phones, which is sad. It actually thinks that projector is a mobile device because it has such a small resolution. I'm not going to show you the site. Okay, well, go visit yourselves, sorry. It's at census.typographica.org. So there's 3 different sections of the report. One is a history of how we got to this point in digital type and who the players were for the first 30 years or so, and in a really nice short summary, and I think it's really worth reading. And the second is a timeline, which gives you a good overview of what all of those key moments were, including founding of new companies and the launch of new software that helps speed font production. But I'd like to focus on the census part of the report. One of the challenges right at the beginning is how does one get a comprehensive sense of who is part of the type design scene? There are likely more than 1,000 font foundries today, or that were launched at some point during the digital era. But not all of these are active now and would not be considered foundries to some people. So some kind of criteria had to be set for Roxandra to complete her study and get an accurate overview. So for her criteria, the first criterion was the producers of retail typefaces, whether they're selling directly to customers or they're distributing it through other companies. And it includes graphic design studios that offer retail type, like A2, but excludes sources that give the type away solely or pay with a tweet or any of those kinds of non-retail distribution. They needed to be, for the purposes of this survey, based in Europe, the Americas, Australia, or New Zealand. Any age or size, including one-person foundries, like or larger foundries. That part didn't matter, but it needed to be independent foundries, so those that aren't owned by a larger conglomerate that don't have other businesses besides type design. And active within the last 5 years, and had a dedicated web presence where they show their goods for sale. To gather this list, she consulted a few different sources. One is Jan Biddendorp's excellent book, Type Navigator, which I think is the most recent and thorough showcase of independent foundries, so thank you, Jan, for that. Where are you? Up there. Typebase is an effort to catalog foundry websites. I don't know how active it is now. Maybe somebody else can tell me, but the website got a major redesign in 2012, and visitors are invited to submit updates. That site is by Donald Ruth. And Roxandra also looked at a Twitter list of type foundries collected by Evo. Thank you, Evo, for that. If you're reading this, you're wasting your time. That's what it says in the background. So I'll saved you 30 seconds from trying to figure out what that was in the binder. You owe me 30 seconds, Evo, wherever you are. So those were Roxandra's main sources for the 300 or so foundries included in the census. She does add that one other publication is worth mentioning, and that's the pioneering indie fonts series from the early 2000s. These were only specimen books, so they didn't add extra insight into the scene, but they are a good document of the explosion of small designer-led foundries from that decade and the proliferation of new fonts from that time. So what did we learn from the 2013 census? A lot of things, and I'll only cover parts of it here, but let's start with the growth of new foundries on the market. In the 1980s, digital pioneers like Elsner and Flocka, Emigre, Font Bureau were born. But in those first 6 years, only a handful of foundries were created. But this is what the next decade looks like. That total doubled within just the first 2 years of the 90s, which became a massive growth period as everyone got in on the action. There were new font formats. TrueType and OpenType were introduced in the 90s. Icarus for the Macintosh was completed, and FontLab came along as an alternative to Fontographer. By the way, a few foundries created during this period, mostly grunge experiments and the like, are no longer active today. And so these aren't included in this graph because they weren't part of the criteria. They're no longer active. In the 2000s, the font formats and editors matured. But more importantly, the number of sales platforms increased significantly. And the ability to sell online, either via retailer or independently, was much more accessible to small foundries. From 2010 to 2012, we saw similar growth as the previous decade. And that low number for 2013 seems to be an outlier, and I imagine it will grow as soon as we make the next update. I think one impact on this period is that the sources that were used didn't necessarily include all the foundries that were launched in 2013. So we learned there are more foundries, and we learned, as we suspected, that most of them are very small. How about a little time warp for contrast? This was type founding in 1919. The image of the linotype factory gives a sense of what type founding looked like in the Metal Era. There were massive industrial operations with hundreds, or even in this case, thousands of employees. And this is type founding in 2015. It's just a guy and his laptop and his dog, and sometimes he doesn't even have a dog. But actually, this is only part of Font Bureau's team, to be fair. They have a dozen or so, but it demonstrates that many foundries have a decentralized staff, and they're spread all over the globe. Here's another part of that distributed Font Bureau staff at their Boston office. This is Victoria Rushton, Diana Weissman, and Samantha Grimsley Franklin. And a lot of foundries also look like this: a couple of partners in a one-room studio, often in the designer's own home. And that's really how a lot of fonts are made today, small shops of 1 to 3 designers. And that's reflected in the numbers. At a quick glance, we can see where the bulk of the industry's players lie, and that's at the very small end. Roughly 95% of the independent foundries that were surveyed have fewer than 5 people on staff. And there are only a handful of foundries, maybe 5 or so, with more than 15 people. We've always known that font production is no longer limited to specific parts of the world. Just looking at the West, again, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia are not included in this version of the census. You can see what the established hotspots are. Most of these are traditional centers for printing or design. But these are just the areas where there are more than 5 foundries. If you really narrow it down to everywhere, you guys can't see this in the slide, but there are little red dots all over the globe. And if we zoom into South America, you can see that has spread. And this is only from 2013. Of course, you can't read all of those, I assume. But if you go onto the website, you'll be able to see them. And Hiki Nardi is going to help me with expanding the Brazilian. So thank you. And he has actually an excellent little spreadsheet online. So if you want to make sure that he'll probably spread that around to people. But I think what we'll need for the next update is to learn from all of you where the additions are in South America. But this map looked nothing like this 10 years ago. It was far more barren. And my hope is that a future version of the census online can include an interactive slider. We all love sliders. So that you can combine the date and the map, and you can see how things have changed over the years in different regions. But part of this growth is also due to the vast improvement in font production tools. Type software has advanced to the point that they dramatically increase the productivity of the font maker. And I can't get into these tools now. Fortunately, we did that in the first day. You've seen a few of them this week: FontLab, Glyphs, RoboFont added to that, and the plugins and the scripts that are associated with them. Because of these, the qualifications for using many of these tools and for creating new fonts are much easier to acquire. And you might think that might lead to masses of poorly made fonts, and it does. But also, the number of professionals is growing at a similar rate. Many of them have degrees in type design, and that was certainly not always the case. About 15 years ago, this is what the education map looked like. There were some type design courses by professionals in a few schools, but no dedicated type design program to speak of. By the year 2000, there were two prominent postgraduate programs, Reading in the UK and Type Media at the Royal Academy in The Hague. In 2010, the US got a type design certificate program at Cooper Union, or Type at Cooper. And just 2 years later, there were at least 11 institutions offering some kind of specialized degree in type design. And this is roughly what the map looks like today, with additions in San Francisco, Mexico City, France, and right here at CINAC in Sao Paulo. So we're probably missing some programs here. If you see a school missing, I encourage you to go edit the Wikipedia page. That's the source I used for this. And due in part to these schools and the availability of the new tools, the growth of font production around the world has been staggering in the last 5 years. So what does this all add up to? What does it mean for type makers and users? For makers, it's more competition, of course, so that's a challenge. And for users, it means more choice. But more choice can also make it more difficult to choose. So this is why I'd like to focus on the market and how fonts are bought and sold, how they're found. But we'll get to that question in a moment. Here's the other big change since the advent of the web. Trends spread faster. And by trends, I mean both the ways fonts are used and the style of typefaces themselves. Take Helvetica as a point of comparison. It was released in the late 50s, but it wasn't until 15 or 20 years later that it saw wide global mainstream use. Despite its association with 1960s modernism, in many ways Helvetica was a typeface of the 70s and 80s. And then it had to come back again in recent years. So back then, it could take a decade or two for something to catch on. Today, it takes mere weeks. Some of you might know what trend I'm referring to by looking at this image. Maybe not if the contrast is too high. Maybe that helps. I can't verify all the details of the timeline, but the story goes something like this. A few months after Apple introduced iOS 7, what many called a flat visual style, web designers followed suit. But they couldn't bear to have something that flat. So they began to add this very long, exaggerated shadow, especially to type. And within weeks, it was a very visible trend on sites like Dribbble. All of these I'm showing here were designed within a 3-month period. And there are many, many, many more, demonstrating the ability of social networks to facilitate the spread of not just kitten videos, but design trends too. Some of these actually make no sense to me. For instance, I didn't know that a flip clock could have a shadow. And then the one on the right, if you can, I don't know if you can see, but it's kind of pseudo-debossed into the paper background, yet it's also casting a shadow over the background. It's very postmodern. And you know that something is a legitimate fad once a generator is created for it. And of course, there's the inevitable backlash. So if these things are true, these two things, something inevitably follows those things. And that's that users are determining what kinds of fonts get made. There are obvious trends in font usage, but also in the design of type itself. This is already the case in retail designs that began as commissions. Of course, a user commissioned that design, but it's also now a common trend in type that's going straight to the retail market. Type designers respond to what's popular in some ways. This isn't new, of course. Type has always followed the design zeitgeist. But what is new is how fast the font market responds to trends. Something that appears on a bestseller list in a prominent design can be replicated in few months or in new fonts within months or weeks, and we saw that with the bestsellers presentation. And here's a very real type design trend, perhaps related to the long shadow, who knows? Chromatic fonts. Fonts that have layers that stack on top of each other for color and shade effects. All of these were released within 2 to 3 years from various foundries. Some are quite good, some are not so good, but there's a good reason for this strategy. Respond to market demand really can work. We also saw evidence of that in bestsellers. Trend-following fonts do sell, at least temporarily. But these fonts tend to be flashes in the pan. They flame up and burn out quickly. And I can understand why a type designer would go down this path. There's something very practical about it, which I admire. But I'm more interested in type that sets trends rather than following them. So how do most fonts reach the customers now? Let's look at it from the perspective of the type designer. If you finished your first font, what are your choices for putting it up for sale? The most traditional way is through a foundry. When you submit a typeface to a foundry for release, it's usually an exclusive deal. They'll maintain the right to sell the font according to their contract, and the royalties can range. But there's an important distinction. Most foundries pay a percentage of the final price of the font. So foundry type can be distributed through multiple channels, such as their own web shop and the shops of their resellers. In this model, as the font goes further down the distribution chain, the designer is getting less of the retail price. Other foundries give a percentage of a suggested retail price, no matter where the font is sold. So the designer gets the same cut no matter what. The biggest advantage of going this route is that a good foundry brings design and technical advice, helping you complete your font. It also lets you get to the market with the least amount of business effort and acumen, because the foundry is handling sales, tech support, retail contracts, etc. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't know about business and understand your contract with the foundry, but it means that you can spend less time administrating and more time drawing type. Another option is to skip the foundry and go straight to a retailer like Font Shop or MyFonts or FontSpring. Resellers sign a contract with the foundry or designer, and they offer the fonts from that foundry's library. The foundry usually receives somewhere around 50% of the retail price of the font, a price that you get to set as the foundry. Each reseller has a different customer base and produces different kinds of quantities of marketing material. Examine them thoroughly and ask about their marketing strategies before you sign up. Some independent foundries, like Type Together and Mark Simonson, have found success in reaching a wide audience by offering fonts through many different resellers. But others go for a more exclusive strategy, limiting to a single reseller that best represents their interests or identity. This path is going to require more work on the designer's part. You're creating your own brand with its own license and policies, which means you get to make more decisions than the foundry path. But you're also responsible for completing the fonts and backing up their quality. On the plus side, most retailers will handle sales and most of the tech support for you. Of course, the main advantage of this method is reaching a wide audience. The drawback is fighting among the other foundries in the shop for attention. The larger the shop, the more potential customers, but then the greater risk of getting buried in the catalog. The other main option for a type maker is to create your own foundry, handling everything, from production to business concerns to marketing and sales on your own shop. Building a foundry and selling fonts exclusively on your own web shop brings you, virtually 100% of the sales with the overhead, of course. Exclusivity has its benefits, as Heffler & Co., Jeremy Tankard, and Line2 will attest. It can give your brand a certain boost in exclusivity and value. But unless you're already well known, it can be a very hard path to follow. It can be a lot of hard work to get your customers to your shop front. And for a while, your shop might look more like a stand at the side of the road. You're out there on your own, hoping somebody will notice you. This also gives you that nagging feeling that you don't know how much more you could have been making if your fonts were available elsewhere. But with patience, if you're willing to stick it out and play the long game, you can build a proper shop, gain a reputation, and have complete control of your business from production to sale. This is the clearest route to independence. Still, it's not without its drawbacks. You must be business savvy or have somebody on your staff who is. You'll spend more time administrating, doing tech support, less time drawing type. And there's potential for substantial overhead for marketing, website, and e-commerce costs. There's also one huge advantage, though. You maintain a relationship with every customer. There's also a huge disadvantage. You maintain a relationship with every customer. This is why the type designer there has that kind of half smile, half frown, a little bit concerned face. It's up to you to decide whether that's a pro or a con. I'd argue that it's mostly a pro, which I'll explain in a moment. So these are the traditional models, but they're certainly not the only ones. We are in no doubt in a state of flux right now in the industry. There are interesting new marketplaces and platforms opening up. There will be more that are in the works. Among these, I see two things happening that could significantly improve the state of the market and the people who work in it. Curation at the retailer level. As the volume of new fonts and new designers explodes, this is obviously increasingly important. And I don't just mean being selective on quality, on the craftsmanship of the drawing and soundness of the technology. I mean having a sense of taste, an eye for originality, and a vision of the future. Curation breeds type that sets trends, not the other way around. As a retailer, FontShop was founded on the basis of curation. Customers looked to FontShop for type that was well-made and interesting. The font slogan was by designers for designers. And the FontShop brand was intended to extend that concept to a retailer, using a high standard to select Foundries for inclusion in the shop. To some observers, the brand lost a bit of that vision and ethos along the way as the collection grew. This is one of the eternal struggles for a reseller, balancing the competing interests of a large, all-inclusive inventory that is useful to customers with the latest releases, with not burying the rest of the products in that inventory. I experienced that firsthand while I was there. For many Foundries, retailers like FontShop still do a good job of keeping these competing interests in balance, but the bar is not high enough for others. For this reason, and lots of others, a few of most of the more interesting designers and Foundries who were once using retailers have gone completely independent, selling all or most of their fonts only on their own websites. Some of this is covered in Ruxandra's analysis on the website, so check out the report. But just for a point of example, here are a few Foundries that no longer sell new fonts to distributors. I'd call this a slow trickle, but the influence of these companies is important. These are bellwether Foundries. FontStand, which launched earlier this year, you heard about it in Jan's talk. It's a retail platform based on an app, which allows customers to try fonts for free or rent them. This model is super handy for users, but it's not entirely new. Monotype had Sky fonts, and Typekit has desktop syncing, which are similar concepts. The main thing that sets FontStand apart is a strict curation of high-quality Foundries. This is attractive to buyers because they know they can rely on the products, but it's also attractive to makers because they know they'll be in good company when they're included. And FontStand has also made it clear that they will grow very slowly and deliberately. So makers know that their stuff will not be buried at least anytime soon. Fortunately, this idea of curation isn't entirely lost on the biggies. At MyFonts, we heard earlier about how they now have a review board and they've rejected more than they've accepted. But previously, their self-described MO is to let the market decide. And until last week, MyFont's promotion, on the website at least, was based purely on sales. But now they're highlighting staff picks. This is part of the homepage redesign from last week. But those big discounts still linger, promoted on the homepage. I wonder if we can learn something from the fashion retail market here. When you enter a major clothing chain like The Gap, there may be a sale sign on the window, but the latest stuff at full price is always up front. And you check it out before you wander into the sale section in the back. You don't have to put price cuts on the homepage, but I recognize that My Fonts has a specific audience and a specific clientele to cater to. I think there's room for that. But I also think there's a necessity for retailers that reach other markets. The second vital improvement needed is this: a direct connection between maker and user. A major drawback with resellers and large foundries is that a sense of the creator is often lost. So often I hear from graphic designers that they are really excited about this new font they got. They got it from My Fonts. Or it's a You Work For Them font. But who made it? People are more aware now that fonts come from humans, which is good. But when they don't get a chance to interact with that human, it's easy to forget. This isn't to say that major retailers don't address that issue. My Fonts devotes a major part of their marketing to the Creative Characters newsletter, which is obviously focused on the individual. But this once-a-month spotlight can't replace the experience of a Foundry-branded destination owned by the creator. Type designers need to know their users too. Who are our users? What do they need? What problems do they have with our fonts? I've heard from many type designers who say that this kind of dialogue with users improves their work, that they got new interesting ideas or commissions by hearing directly from customers. And unless you're selling to them directly, most of this gets filtered away. So let's get back to Florian's quote. He wasn't saying here necessarily that it's a bad thing, that there are too many fonts, but he's saying it doesn't make it easier to get the font that you want just because there are more out there. How do we solve this problem? I don't have all the answers, but I do know that it needs to happen on both sides of the equation. Buyers and sellers both need a better market, one that respects both their needs, one that empowers type users to make good choices, and one that gives type designers the incentive to produce innovative and useful work. I don't know if you guys have farmers markets here in Berlin, or Brazil. I never know where I am. Your markets are a lot larger than the ones that I know at home, but all across America, farmers markets have grown in popularity, particularly in California, where I live most of the year. And we live close to agriculture, and there's a lot of new concern about where our food comes from. So the farmers market is become much more popular there. It's an alternative to the supermarket where we could go every week and buy all in one place most of the food we need for that week. Bread, eggs, milk, fruit, meat. Of course, there are the buzzwords: organic, artisan, handcrafted, etc. But what makes this market more interesting to me is that instead of a supermarket that buys all the goods and then resells them to us, we're buying directly from the people who grew or baked or milked the stuff. Each vendor has a stand. Many of the stands are run by the people who actually run the farm. Each neighborhood market has a committee that chooses which farms to include in their local markets. It's a combination of retail curation, remember that word, with a direct buyer-seller connection. That connection is a big part of what makes these markets great. We know that our money is going directly to the growers. We know that the quality is good because they are literally standing behind their product every week. And we get to know the growers themselves. We give them direct feedback on their product. We have a personal relationship of mutual respect. Are there ideas here that can be implemented in the font market? Sometimes that answer to that is not in the market at all. Fonts in use in Typographica are editorial efforts to bring curation and direct connection between maker and user. And I'm working with some of the people behind these sites on something new that responds to these core problems. These include smart folks like Marina Shakur, Rob Meek, Nick Sherman, Florian Hardvig, Chris Lewis, and David Jonathan Ross, who's not part of our core team, but offers a type designer's perspective in an advisory role. These are some of the most brilliant people in the type world to me. I can't imagine building something like what we're building without them. Mostly, I just kind of water ski on their wake. I wish I could say more about the project now. It's simply too early, and it's too top secret. But what I can say is, just kidding. No, I'm joking. It's not a My Fonts killer. In fact, we expect our thing to coexist with My Fonts and other retail platforms in a healthy ecosystem. What we're building is not another shop. It's a guide. It's a tool to help users find the right typeface and connect them to the best place to license that typeface. And the choice for that destination starts with the people who make the fonts. So that route could lead to a Foundry website, or it could lead to a retailer, whatever the Foundry prefers. In the coming weeks, we'll be talking to many of you who are type designers or who run Foundries about how you can be part of this project. So expect a nudge from Marina or Nick or Florian or myself very soon. Our solution is an editorial and educational one at its core, but there is no single answer to these problems. There are solutions that can come from retailers and other people in this community as well. There could be new retail concepts. I see hope for these on the horizon. In the end, what I want to see is type designers maintain their independence in some way, to do good work, to make good choices, to respect themselves and their colleagues. I want this because I love this craft, but also because I love these people. I want to see them continue to do what they love on their own terms. Thanks. Is that accurate? Is that true? Is that number true? Has it really only been half an hour?
Good. Thank you very much. We have time for one or two questions. Any questions?
I can't believe I answered all the questions already. Is this a question or a correction, Jan?
Well, in HTML, you've got this thing, or also in XML, where you go like italic, and then after the word there is slash italic. This, what I'm saying, is now preceded by slash myfonts. I think one of the things that is most difficult for everybody using something like the internet for making choices is that there is too much. We're all, and even when it comes to news, politics, whatever, there's too much. So what everybody needs when they want to make choices is less. So I totally agree with what you say. It's very good. I have also been talking within my fonts about starting at some point maybe something that offers less, like a boutique. At the same time, that wouldn't have much credibility because it's still part of that big monolith. So in order to do what you think is necessary, you guys got to do it. And I'm all for it. And you've got very good people on board, because Florian Hartwig, for instance, is the guy that I work with most in Berlin. And so I hope to get news very soon, and I wish you all the luck.
Thank you.
That's all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan.
Questions? No?
Yeah, new type designers who have... Okay. I know that there are a lot of budding type designers in the audience, so if you have questions about what you should be doing, or you need help from other people in the audience, I think we should have a discussion about that.
No, we can discuss the party.
Or at the party. Let's have it at the party. That's more fun.
I'm sorry, this won't be a question, but a correction about
thank you.
one very specific aspect of your presentation, which is type education. Lots of type designers also have an educational occupation. I just would like to stand for a couple of minutes against the preconceived idea that before Reading and The Hague, there was nothing in type education. Me and a bunch of fellows have been trained in one of the oldest type design course of the past 30 years. It's actually 30 years now. I won't cite him, but I would like just to say that there are many, many very good type education places around the world. The rest of the sentences were true, but type education didn't suddenly popped up at that time. And I'd just like to remind that there are older courses than that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to come to you for a better map. Yeah, the map was supposed to represent postgraduate programs, but I think that's an excellent point that we need to, show that there was a lot of other type design education happening before that.
Hi, sorry. Thank you. Very nice presentation. I do have a question. I wonder whether the graphic design community needs us to actually curate the fonts that we show them, that we offer them, in order for them to use good typefaces, or actually need us to, well, or to what extent do they need us to teach them how to choose typefaces instead of actually curating the contents they can see?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I've tried to write about picking type. It's a difficult topic, and there's always more that we can say. And I agree that education comes from, I think that should be top on the list of anybody who's making or selling fonts, because that's, first of all, it's going to get a lot of attention. People want to be informed, and it's also obviously necessary. So type selection is something that people can continue to write about and giving their perspectives on. It's really important.
Maybe if the curation process is a transparent one, and not simply, hey, we picked this one because we think it's nice. That you might put curation and education in the same page.
Yes. Yeah. Why did we pick this?
Exactly.
Yep.
That might solve this question.
Mm-hmm.
I think we covered some questions, and I'm sure there'll be loads more, and we can keep discussing things at the party. And unfortunately, we are over with the talks for ATypI this year, but you still get to celebrate tonight, and hope to see you all in Warsaw next year. Yeah.